Hey everyone, this is Ezekiel O'Callahan with Raptor Chatter, and as you may notice, we're not in our normal filming location, and that's because we had audio issues and had to re-record the audio separately after we were already in the field. And I'm in the field to see some rocks in their natural habitats, and so there's some right over here, where you can see some of these little structures that are actually compressed rocks from animals that were walking across it. So these are kind of like footprints, but in reverse. So that's what I'm working on in the field. If you want to join the Patreon, you can actually see a couple video updates on this. So with all of that said, let's get started on September 2021 in paleontology. Radiodonts are kind of a fake group, and that's not because the animals didn't exist, but it's because it's really hard to try and define what is and isn't a radiodont. And this was a group of animals that included animals like Anomalocaris most famously. And they mostly lived in the Cambrian over 500 million years ago and were pretty much soft-bodied, so they didn't get preserved very well in most cases. But there is still a lot of diversity within this group, including the Herdiids, and there was actually a new fossil found that is the largest known Herdiid from the Cambrian, and it's been named Titanosaurus gainsi. Now the Herdiids were actually the longest living and surviving group of the radiodonts. They actually made it into the Devonian, and they were mostly filter feeders or silt sifters, and that seems to have actually paid off because they did make it to the Devonian. And part of the Herdiid's success may have actually been their diversity, with Titanosaurus being significantly larger than any of the other relatives that it had during the Cambrian. And it wasn't super massive, it was about half a meter long, so a foot and a half or so. But compared to the related animals at the same time, it was absolutely massive. So it helps to show that these animals were diversifying pretty rapidly in the Cambrian, and could have potentially led to their success after that time. And staying in the Devonian, there was a group of fossils that were found that actually do make it to the modern day, although this group that this one does come from doesn't. And to make sense of that, it's a new ctenophore, and the ctenophores are often called comb jellies in the modern day, and there's a lot of them that live in the deep oceans. However, this new one isn't directly related to any of those. Daihuoides jacobvintheri has just been described from the Devonian of Canada. It seems to be related to two very early and now extinct groups of ctenophores, both of which disappear in the fossil record millions of years before Daihuoides, making it the last occurrence of this group of ctenophores, which shows that there's actually a lot of diversity in the ctenophores that existed in the fossil record that we just may not have because these animals are really hard to try and preserve, and that what we see today isn't the total diversity that this group actually achieved. And staying in the Devonian again, but this time moving to land, vernal pools have been preserved in the fossil record. And a vernal pool just means that it's a pool of water that shows up outside of the main waterways within that ecosystem. This means that many different things can actually be preserved in these pools, because there's normally not as much life in them as there would be in the main waterways. And because of this, researchers were able to study in pretty good detail the sediments that had been deposited in one vernal pool, and actually make some conclusions about the different types of life that would have been around during the time. Now, there were some fish fossils in this, however, they're really not that important to the story that these authors were telling. And that's because what was more important are the plant fossils from there. The Devonian was a very interesting time in Earth's history, because it was really the time period when plants started to colonize the land and start to take over major ecosystems on land. And so what we actually find in this vernal pool system is that a lot of the sediments don't actually have significant roots going through them. And that helps us suggest that there weren't plants that could necessarily grow very high for large portions of this pool's existence. However, as you go throughout the system, eventually root systems do start to show up. However, they all seem pretty much consistent with one another. And that helps us suggest that there wasn't a lot of diversity as the forest started to take over the area where this pool was. So what it seems like is in the Devonian, when the first forests formed, whatever the first plant to make it to an area was, essentially took over that area entirely. And then later, as plants continued to develop and evolve over millions of years, you started to get the more complex niches that we find in modern day forests. There was also more plant material coming from a time period much closer to us, and that's the Middle Miocene, about 15 million years ago. And this actually comes from Spain in the Madrid Basin, and the Madrid Basin is actually a lot larger than just the city of Madrid, so the researchers were able to find 10 different localities from which to take samples. And what they were looking for wasn't massive plant fossils, instead it was pollen. Pollen can be very distinctive between different plant groups, and that means the researchers were able to try and identify what plants were present in the Middle Miocene in Spain. And this is important because this was a time period of massive climate change, because right after the KPG extinction that killed off the dinosaurs, there was a massive warming trend that kept the world warm for most of the Cenozoic. And then in the Middle Miocene, it started to cool off pretty significantly. The plant pollens that were found in the Madrid Basin help to tell this story, because those pollens are indicative of plants that are more salt tolerant and drought tolerant, which suggests that the lake that was present in this basin would start to experience some evaporation and wouldn't get recharged by massive amounts of rain like it would have if the climate was warmer. So this cooling period potentially lowered the amount of rain across parts of Europe, leading to a more grassland-like environment, and some of the wetlands that were still left behind also would have become more salty, and that would have required these more salt-resistant plants in order to become successful. This is also the beginning of a trend of a pivot towards grasslands that continued into the Pliocene and even into the Pleistocene. It essentially helped to set up most of the kinds of environments that we have today. So whatever happened in the Middle Miocene really is important for our modern day understanding of our current environments. And on top of that, there's even more recent fossils coming from lake sediments, but this time in North America. And these fossils actually have to do directly with human interaction with the environment, because they are human fossils, specifically footprints coming from White Sands, New Mexico. The White Sands of White Sands, New Mexico are white because they're made up of the mineral gypsum. And gypsum is a mineral that shows up when you have large lakes that start to dry up. It's kind of like a salt in that it starts to appear and precipitate out when it becomes too concentrated in drying lake beds. And that means the researchers were able to find human footprints in these drying lake bed sediments. And that alone isn't new, but these ones are older than any of the previous ones found. And the researchers were able to tell that by looking at pollen and seeds in the rock layers that these footprints were found in. And they found that these footprints would have been between about 23 and 21,000 years old, which is actually about 2,000 years before the start of the Last Glacial Maximum, when humans were thought to have made it to North America. Additionally, since these fossils are so distant from the land bridge that would have existed between Asia and North America, it helps to suggest that humans actually got to North America relatively early, at least compared to what we had previously thought. And it also could potentially suggest one of the particular migration routes that some researchers have thought is more likely, and that's the inland migration route. This is largely based on some of the language similarities between some of the peoples on the Colorado Plateau, like the Navajo, and some peoples in many northern parts of the continent, like parts of Alaska. So this means that there's potentially something that we can learn about modern day indigenous cultures based on these fossils that are thousands of years old. And that's important because a lot of these indigenous cultures have been almost eradicated by European colonization. And when we talk about humans devastating things, we need to also consider the environment. And there's actually some research that helps us suggest that some of the things that we're seeing happen in modern day environments affected by humans did also happen in the past, although not because of humans. Specifically, this paper looked at the Permian-Triassic extinction, which if you follow this channel at all, you know the deal that I spread about this. About 95% of marine life died, 75% of life on land. There were giant volcanoes called the Siberian Traps that probably released a lot of gases that led to this. However, there's not been a lot done on freshwater ecosystems, and part of the reason for that might be that they may have had a longer recovery period than other ecosystems. So, as I mentioned, life on land suffered and the forests almost completely collapsed. And in the modern day, when we see large forest die-offs, we also see an increase in microbial and algal blooms in different water bodies. And many of these can actually be toxic, so it slows down a lot of the life that's occurring in those water bodies. In order to test if this was happening in the past, some researchers looked at Permian-Triassic lake sediments in Australia. And based on the chemical data in the rocks, yes, this was happening. And these blooms seem to have been pretty extensive. For about 3 million years, they continue to cycle and would have polluted many freshwater ecosystems in the area. And if this is tested in other areas by looking at other freshwater systems, it may indicate that this was a very widespread occurrence, and could have been very significant in slowing down the recovery of life on land, as many freshwater ecosystems may not have been able to recover. But there was also a look at lake sediments from later into the Triassic, the period that followed the Permian-Triassic extinction, to try and understand what was happening during the Carnian Pluvial episode. The Carnian Pluvial episode was one of the most intense and significant time periods with massive climate change, although this was generally positive because it was reintroducing a lot of the rainfall that was lost from the Permian-Triassic extinction. And so essentially many environments over the course of about 2 million years completely changed, from mostly arid environments to being very, very damp and almost swamp-like conditions. The new study of lake sediments in China has shown that this might have been linked to volcanic activity. And this was done with multiple methods, including more of these kinds of pollen studies, but also trying to correlate certain chemicals in those lake sediments with volcanic eruptions that would have been happening in the Wrangelian Large Igneous Province. The Wrangellia Large Igneous Province occurred when an entire volcanic arc of islands was slamming into Alaska, and actually helped to build large parts of that region. And much of this information is actually kind of lost because that mountain building process damaged and distorted a lot of these rocks, but it is very likely that this is the source of many of these volcanic chemicals. And these volcanic chemicals do actually coordinate very well with changes in the pollen that was found in these lake sediments. So it does seem like some of this volcanism may have been the driver for positive climate change, with more rainfall leading to a recovery of life and more diversity in life. And it does help to show how very different effects can be had by very similar types of events in the geologic record. But the Triassic isn't the only time that there's lakes in China that also have volcanic sediments. And what I'm talking about is actually some of the most famous fossil beds in China, and those are those containing the J-hole biota, which is made up of the Yixian and Jiufotang formations. And these have actually been really poorly dated so far, although there was some work on the Yixian earlier this year. And now it seems like a similar team of researchers is doing the same thing, but with the Jiufotang formation. And what they found is it was about 122 to 119 million years old. And the most important work to come from this paper is actually still to come, because there's a lot of really incredible fossils in this formation, including many early birds, including feathers being preserved. So hopefully researchers will be able to use this more specific time period for this formation and the knowledge of the fossils from this formation to try and coordinate when different changes in different groups occurred in a more time-based framework, rather than a much more generalized framework. But there's also new stuff coming from the older Yixian formation, and that includes actual cells from a dinosaur. The dinosaur was Caudipteryx, and the researchers were able to essentially cut off part of the femur bone and dissolve it in acid. And this makes sense because the bone would be mostly calcium and it does dissolve in acid much easier. However, some cartilage cells were still preserved, and they're not necessarily original cartilage cells. They were still mineralized, however, instead of having calcium go into them, it was largely things like silicon and iron, which don't dissolve as easily. This meant that once the bone was dissolved around these cartilage cells, they could be looked at under a microscope and compared to modern-day cartilage cells in animals like chickens. The researchers found that there wasn't too much difference, which honestly is to be expected. A lot of the basic cells that do help build up different animal bodies are pretty similar, and honestly, Caudipteryx and chickens aren't that distantly related, so this should be expected. However, it is really exciting to get more cells preserved, even all the way down to the nucleus like some of these are, and it's something that has been occurring more and more regularly in many different types of fossil environments. So hopefully more research will be done on paleocellular biology, because that would help us to start understanding how some of these animals were functioning more directly within their environments. And so within the lakes of the J-hole biota, there was a new type of bird found, named Euanchoavis compsosura. It had very long tail feathers, which probably indicate that they were driven by sexual selection within this species, and it could have even been potentially subject to the handicap principle, where, like a peacock, the larger tail would have had more success for wooing mates, but also like peacocks, once the tail gets too large, it actually hampers their ability to fly, making them more likely to be predated upon by animals like tigers that live in their environment. And so this may actually be a very good indication that some of the first birds and relatives of birds, like the Enantiornithines, may have still been subject to many of the same evolutionary pressures that we do see in the modern day. But not all dinosaurs, and even dinosaurs that are relatively closely related to birds, use the same kind of feather-based displays. And it seems like tyrannosaurs, like some of their relatives that are crocodilians, actually bit each other during some of their mating behaviors. And that's because many different Tyrannosaurus fossils have been found with bite marks on the face. Now, eventually, as you start to move closer to birds, this behavior is actually completely lost. In fact, the dromaeosaurs or raptor dinosaurs, which are very closely related to birds, don't have this behavior at all either. This means that somewhere along the Silurisaurian lineage, somewhere between Tyrannosaurs and the dromaeosaurs and other bird-like relatives, there was a change in behavior, where mating displays became less based on aggressive biting types of interactions, and instead became more based on feathers and displays. And that eventually led us to the birds that we do have today. And for more on this, actually, the Royal Tyrrell Museum does have some of the authors on this paper, and one of them did give a talk there. So if you want to see someone talk about all of the evidence that went into this paper for about an hour or so, you can go see that on the Royal Tyrrell Museum YouTube page. Now, as I mentioned, some crocodilians also engage in this kind of face-biting behavior, and one of the crocodilian groups is the Gharials, and they're kind of a pain, especially when it comes to understanding which groups of other crocodilians they're most closely related to. There's some studies that help to suggest that they're actually really close to crocodilians, true crocodilians that is, and these are mostly the genetic studies. However, when we look at the morphology and different types of bone shapes that exist in all of the different kinds of broad crocodilians, normally it's found that alligators and crocodiles are closest to each other, with Gharials as kind of an outgroup. A new study, though, looked at Gharials in greater detail and also some fossil Gharials in greater detail, and hopefully has actually resolved 40 years of debate in what the relationships between different crocodilians actually are. Now, the thing to remember is any one of these phylogenies is just a hypothesis. It still needs to be tested even more so until it's more or less proved. However, this does at least fall in line with what the genetic evidence has been telling us. Additionally, these researchers did look at Gharials and their relatives in a geographic context to try and understand where they started and how they ended up to where they are today. And it seems like they actually took a pretty large journey. It seems most likely that they started in South America and then at some point crossed the Atlantic into parts of Europe and then migrated down to where they live today in parts of Southeast Asia and India. So they're very distinct from where they started, and the fact that they're not still there does bring some questions about on why they migrated so significantly. So while it is really great to have this phylogeny that it does seem to line up better with our previous understanding of the genetics of crocodilians, there's still a lot of questions to answer about how Gharials became what they are today. And on the subject of the crocodilians, they're one of the groups of tetrapods that has moved back to the water. And there's a lot of these, like whales, sea snakes, and otters, and a whole host of other things, including in the fossil record where there's even more of them. And this paper dealt with a lot of the math on how these animals would have actually swam, and they picked out specific features that helped it be indicators of how the animals would have swam, including whether it would have been more flipper-driven movement or more tail-driven movement. Hopefully this will be able to help set up a framework for more future work, especially since now there is that mathematical background, so this work can be done in a more qualitative fashion rather than just quantitative through observation. And with continuing mechanical research, there was a study on the function of tails in dinosaur movement. The researchers basically recorded a bunch of birds running in multiple dimensions, and then they modeled that. And once the models were working pretty good on the birds, they modeled a dinosaur and ran that through it. And the dinosaur they used was actually Coelophysis, one of the very early theropod dinosaurs. And there's a few different things they found, most notably that the tip of the tail would have wagged in kind of an infinity pattern, and there's a couple of different reasons they give that this may have been the case. The first is the tips of the tail's movement coincides with the hip flexing, and so the tail moving to the side may have actually increased the length of that muscle at least temporarily, and then as it helped flex the hip, it would have actually driven more strength into that leg. The movement of the tail may have also helped serve as a more dynamic counterbalance to the head and the arms moving. And the model that they used didn't really engage in any potential head or arm movements, but if the animal was doing those kinds of movements, there's a chance that this already wagging tail could provide a more active counterbalance for those movements, helping the animal be more agile. There's also a potential hypothesis that the animal may have tried to maximize this movement. However, that was tested to some degree, but it still needs more testing. In fact, all these ideas do need more testing. However, the models do seem really promising, and so hopefully there will be more work done with this framework so we can try and understand how the dinosaurs got around. And still on movement of the theropods and even very coelophysis-like animals, there was an early Jurassic South African trackway, which helps to show how the theropods would have gotten around at least some environments. And that's because it shows the hallux of the foot. And the hallux just means it's the first digit, so on us, it's our big toes. But in dinosaurs, and especially theropod dinosaurs, this toe was actually very small and reduced. It normally doesn't even show up in fossil tracks. So that means that this animal pushed deep enough into the mud to have that small first toe actually make contact with it. But this wasn't a very large animal. The tracks themselves are only a few centimeters long, so rather than the animal pushing in deeply because of its weight, it's far more likely that it was just running through mud that was very, very soft. The tracks were also covered by microbial mats, which formed a kind of network pattern on the surface. It also helped to kind of solidify the surface of these tracks to potentially have them be preserved even better. However, even with that better preservation, there's only 5 of these tracks, although they can be used to at least estimate the speed of the animal, and it was probably going around 12.5 kilometers per hour or about 8 miles per hour. And again, the tracks are very small, so that means this animal was booking it, at least relative to its size. And this kind of speed may have been one of the important features that dinosaurs had, which did cause them to become successful over the other large archosaurs from the Triassic. And on the subject of some of those other large archosaurs from the Triassic, there were new finds of Revueltosaurus found. And Revueltosaurus was actually first described as a dinosaur. It was thought to have been an ornithischian dinosaur, so one of the more herbivorous dinosaurs. However, as more fossils of it came out, it did seem to get placed much closer to the Pseudosuchians, a group of crocodile-like archosaurs which lived on land, and it technically does include actual crocodiles as well. However, during the Triassic, they were much more land-based. But now there's a new quarry containing at least 12 individuals of Revueltosaurus, and that's helped us to build a better picture and understanding of the animal. Phylogenetically, it was much closer to the Aedosaurs than to other groups of Pseudosuchians. For this, we really couldn't tell exactly where it lined up. But this does make sense, because the Aedosaurs were heavily armored and, unlike most of the other Pseudosuchians, herbivorous, as was Revueltosaurus. So this isn't entirely shocking, but it's more so that Revueltosaurus doesn't fall perfectly into the Aedosaurs. Instead, it and a few other fossils are just next to the Aedosaurs, which helps us show that there was a very distinctive clade of herbivorous Pseudosuchians around during the late Triassic, and that the environments that were still developing in the late Triassic were very complex, even as they began to become more and more dinosaur-dominated in the later Triassic and into the Jurassic. Now, those fossils of Revueltosaurus came from petrified forest, and within the same geologic region of the Colorado Plateau, there was also a new true dinosaur found, and a ceratopsid at that, named Sierraceratops turneri. It was found in central New Mexico, where there's actually been a lot of recent fossil work done. The phylogenetic testing of Sierraceratops shows that it's closely related to Bravoceratops and Coahuilaceratops, which are both southwestern North American taxa. So it's really good that people are getting into New Mexico for research, as it seems like there's some very distinct fossils that are being found, and also a distinct group of fossils that were living in the larger area, including other regions where Bravoceratops and Coahuilaceratops were living. And it also helps us suggest that ceratopsians in particular were very prone to speciation and endemism. And so that just means there's a parent species that would be inhabiting many different areas. And as those areas started to become more isolated, the different populations would start to prefer different frill shapes, and eventually become different species from each other entirely. And that's going to be really hard to test for sure, but it's at least one idea as to why there are so many different types of ceratopsians. And like Sierraceratops, this animal also comes from the late Cretaceous. However, it comes from the late Cretaceous of Brazil, and it represents a new abelisaur, and this one was actually pretty small, about 5 meters or around 15 feet in length, and it's also very partial. It's basically just a pelvis. But I do want to mention it because its name in particular did get some press, and also abelisaurs are neat. Kurupi Itaata, and the genus name is actually after an indigenous fertility god near where it was found, and the photos of that god are not safe for work, so be sure to Google it with the entire species name also included. And abelisaurs really are neat, so I did want to emphasize this one. And also coming from the late Cretaceous of South America, but this time in Argentina, there was a bone bed that was, honestly, most of the fossils are busted up, but we can at least tell a few different things about the environment. For example, there are abelisaur teeth, and so this includes relatives of things like Carnotaurus rugops and the recently named Kurupi. Additionally, there's some titanosaurian sauropod bones and nodosaur and ankylosaur bones, which these are similar animals, but they're slightly different armored dinosaurs. But that's not all, because all those animals are just the dinosaurs that were found. But there were also at least 4 different types of crocodilian teeth found. So there's seemingly a decent variety of different crocodilians that were also in this environment. And even though these fossils are so broken up, it does mean we can at least get a decent picture of what was going on in this part of South America before the impact occurred. And hopefully some more complete fossils will come out of this site in the future, so we can try and understand what was happening in this region even better. And now for things that I have talked about. There were 2 new spinosaurs named coming from the Isle of Wight in the UK. The first is Sierraceratops inferiorus, which comes from the Greek for keratos, meaning horn, because it had some rugose textures and kind of wrinkly textures over the eye, which probably supported part of a horn, and sukos, which is Greek for crocodile. Meanwhile, the other part of the name, inferiorios, comes from the Latin for the underworld, and aridios, which is Greek for heron, so a hell heron, and this is based on the expected behavior for this animal. The other was named Riparovenator milneri, with riparo coming from riparian, which is just a kind of river environment, venator meaning hunter, and milneri for the late Angela Milner, who was actually one of the most important paleontologists for Spinosaur paleontology in particular. She helped to write the major paper on baryonyx that lets us understand a lot of what these different Spinosaurs would have been doing. And these 2 new Spinosaurs actually show up being fairly close relatives of baryonyx. In fact, they all would have lived in around the same time period, during the Barremian stage of the Cretaceous about 127 million years ago. And these 2 new ones are pretty partial, but their pieces do overlap. This meant the researchers were able to study the same parts of the animal and see how they were different, and that's why they were able to name 2 entirely different genera based on these fossils. Again, I did an entire video where I get a lot more into what all of these differences are, but for right now it does seem like it is valid to call these 2 different species. There was also an idea that wasn't fully published, instead it was just kind of proposed and unofficially published on ResearchGate by the author of the paper. And the author was Andrea Cow, who proposed that some compsognathids may actually just be juveniles of much larger dinosaurs. And there's actually quite a few compsognathids that have been found to also be juveniles. But this is the first time that even unpeer-reviewed research has kind of laid out a good groundwork for how to try and test some of these ideas. And that includes looking at things that may not change as the animal gets older, and will be more consistent throughout its life to try and understand how those features are more related to some of the adults of other species that we do have. My wife actually recorded this video, and you'll be able to find it down in the link below. And I just want to emphasize one more time again, this isn't peer-reviewed. It's much more like something that probably would have been presented at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meeting if it was happening in person, because some researchers just have an apprehension to going to mostly online meetings, which is entirely fair. And there was also a new carcharodontosaur found, and this one was named Ulubegsaurus uzbekistanensis, and it was found in the same environment as an early tyrannosaur, Timurlengia. It also lived in Uzbekistan, as the species name might suggest, with Ulubeg being a legend in Uzbek culture. It is also incredibly partial. It's basically just a maxilla bone, which is one of the bones in the skull. However, since it is from a very specific location that doesn't have other carcharodontosaurs, and because there are some features that are a little bit different, it does seem reasonable to call it its own genus and species. It's also important to note that this was probably the dominant predator in this environment. It wouldn't have been the largest carcharodontosaur. It was only about 25 feet long, 7 to 8 meters, but it was much larger than Timurlengia, which would have been much closer to about 4 meters. So it was definitely the most dominant predator in this environment, and many of the other environments before the tyrannosaurs really came to dominance during the later part of the late Cretaceous.
Hi everyone, thanks for watching. This is Danielle, the editor. Thank you so much for being patient with us with this video. I know it took a long time to come out. just a lot of things happening right now. And then we were out in the field for a couple days and the audio kept having problems, but it's finally out. Let us know in the comments if you like this style. We might try to make the monthly reviews more in this style so we can slowly work on it throughout the month instead of recording all at once at the end of the month. As always, we want to thank our patrons, which we have 2 new ones, Thomas Cadleck and Sarah. If you want to know more of what we're doing out in the field at Zeke's research site, you can join the Patreon, where we will begin posting updates whenever we're out there, just showing you a little bit about what research is going on, as well as what interesting finds we have and such. You might be getting me hosting a video or 2 again this week, since tomorrow Zeke is leaving for another field research trip, which doesn't give us a whole lot of time to work on scripts and videos. But be patient, we're going to figure this all out. We do want to keep making videos, it's driving us crazy. We're just trying to figure out how to get our life in order. And lastly, as always, remember to be safe, take care, and don't go extinct.